January 12th, 1943. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stands in a captured British supply depot near Benghazi, staring at something that makes his stomach tighten, with a feeling worse than the dysentery that's been plaguing him for months. Wooden crates stretch in neat rows under canvas awnings. American markings cover everything. Spam, corned beef, cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, ammunition boxes stacked higher than a man's head. His logistics officer, Lieutenant Colonel Otto, walks between the rows, reading labels aloud with something approaching disbelief in his voice. "Herr Feldmarschall, there are 40 tons of rations here, just rations. No ammunition, no fuel, just food. And cigarettes, crates of cigarettes." Rommel picks up a can of American peaches. The label shows a perfect yellow fruit in heavy syrup. He weighs it in his hand, then sets it down carefully, as if it might explode. "Do you know what my forward infantry received yesterday?" His voice is quiet. 300 grams of Italian tinned meats per man for the entire day. The meat was dated 1939. Otto says nothing. What can he say? They both know the numbers. British 8th Army soldiers receive 2,800 calories daily. German Afrika Korps troops are rationed 1,800 and often receive less when convoys sink in the Mediterranean. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Rommel walks outside, where January sun beats down on sand, already baking hot by mid-morning. In the distance, black smoke rises from a burning fuel dump. His own engineers set the fire rather than leave anything for Montgomery's pursuing forces. The irony isn't lost on him. The British abandon supply depots full of food because they're moving too fast to bother with it. His army burns its own fuel supplies because there isn't enough transport to move them. This moment, standing in a depot filled with American abundance, represents something more than tactical frustration for Rommel. It's the beginning of understanding. Not just that Germany is losing the North African campaign, but why. The answer isn't courage, or tactics, or even generalship. It's something more fundamental, more devastating. It's arithmetic on a scale he's never encountered before. To understand how Rommel arrived at this realization, you have to go back 18 months to June 1942, when everything still seemed possible. The Afrika Korps had just captured Tobruk, taking 33,000 prisoners and enormous quantities of British supplies. Rommel stood in the fortress he'd besieged for 8 months and believed Egypt lay open before him. Hitler promoted him to field marshal. Mussolini flew to North Africa with a white horse, planning to ride triumphantly into Cairo. The dream of Suez, of the oil fields beyond, of cutting Britain's lifeline to India, seemed within reach. Then they ran into something unexpected. Not British resistance at El Alamein, though that was fierce. Not Montgomery's superior tactics, though those proved effective. They ran into American industrial production. The numbers started appearing in intelligence reports during summer 1942. Ships unloading in Alexandria, in Port Said, in Suez. Not British ships primarily, but American ones. Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels rolling out of American shipyards at a rate that seemed impossible. German intelligence officers in Rome compiled the data with growing disbelief. August 1942, 140 American ships departed U.S. ports bound for Egypt. September, 163 ships. October, 189. Each ship carried 10,000 tons of cargo. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, food, fuel, spare parts, everything an army needed. The mathematics were straightforward. By late 1942, American and British ships were delivering approximately 12,000 tons of supplies daily to Egypt. 12,000 tons, every day. The number haunted Rommel's logistics staff. The entire Afrika Korps required 60,000 tons of supplies monthly to maintain offensive operations. The Americans were landing that amount in Egypt every 5 days, and that was just what arrived. Production was higher. Convoy losses to U-boats were already calculated into the numbers. Werner von Mellenthin, Rommel's chief intelligence officer, and presented the figures at a staff meeting in September 1942. The field marshal listened without interrupting, his face growing more rigid with each statistic. When Mellenthin finished, Rommel stood and walked to the situation map. "And our supply situation?" he asked quietly. His quartermaster, Major Wilhelm Meister, cleared his throat. "We require 15,000 tons monthly to maintain current defensive positions, 20,000 for limited offensive operations, 60,000 for a sustained offensive to the Nile Delta." He paused. "Last month we received 7,000 tons, the month before 5,000. This month looks worse. 2 tankers sunk last week, another convoy turned back because of submarine threats." The conference tent fell silent except for flies buzzing against the canvas. Outside, soldiers laughed at some joke. Inside, the men around the map table understood what the numbers meant. The Afrika Korps was being strangled, not quickly, not dramatically, but with mathematical certainty. Every ship that sailed from Italy carrying fuel and ammunition faced British submarines, British aircraft, British surface raiders. The route from Naples to Tripoli was 800 nautical miles, through waters the Royal Navy increasingly controlled. Convoys that made it to Tripoli then faced another problem. The supplies had to travel overland to the front. Tripoli to El Alamein was 1,400 miles across a single coastal road. British aircraft bombed that road every day. Trucks broke down. Fuel evaporated in the heat. By the time supplies reached forward units, half the shipment from Italy might be lost to enemy action, mechanical failure, or simple wastage. Meanwhile, American supplies landing in Alexandria traveled 150 miles to the front over a railroad the British had been operating for 60 years. Modern ports with cranes and warehouses, paved roads, maintenance facilities, everything worked. Rommel sent a detailed report to Berlin in October 1942, outlining the supply crisis. He needed 200,000 tons monthly to match British logistical capacity. He received a response from the High Command acknowledging his concerns and promising better supply coordination. The promises meant nothing. German and Italian shipping in the Mediterranean continued to die. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, Axis forces attempted to ship 850,000 tons of supplies to North Africa. 640,000 tons actually arrived. 210,000 tons, nearly 25%, went to the bottom of the Mediterranean. The lost tonnage included 250,000 tons of fuel. Without fuel, the most sophisticated tank in the world becomes an expensive pillbox. But the disparity wasn't just quantity, it was waste. Abundance so extreme, it looked like waste to German eyes. Rommel saw this firsthand throughout the campaign. After every battle where his forces overran British positions, they found supplies abandoned casually, left behind because bringing them forward wasn't worth the effort. Canned fruit, fresh vegetables, medical supplies, still in original packaging. Christmas 1942, Afrika Korps, soldiers in defensive positions south of Sirte, opened, captured British ration tins for a holiday meal. Roast beef, plum pudding, tea and sugar, chocolate bars marked U.S. Army, letters home described the meal with something approaching wonder. German rations at that point consisted primarily of Italian tinned meat of dubious quality, bread when available, and ersatz coffee made from roasted grain. One German officer, Lieutenant Heinz Schmidt of the 5th Panzer Regiment, wrote in his diary, "We captured a British supply truck today. Inside, we found cigarettes, hundreds of packets, also tinned butter, real butter, jam, biscuits, clean socks. My men looked at these things as if they were treasure. Not because we're starving exactly, but because such abundance seems impossible. Where does it all come from?" The answer was America. Specifically, American factories running 3 shifts daily, producing war material at rates no European nation could match. The numbers defy belief until you examine them closely. In 1942, American factories produced 47,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, 17,000 artillery pieces. That same year, Germany produced 15,000 aircraft, 9,000 tanks, 12,000 artillery pieces. The disparity grew worse in 1943. By then, American production was truly hitting stride. 60,000 tons of shipping launched monthly from American yards. That's not a misprint. 60,000 tons of new ships every month, far more than U-boats could sink. The mathematics of industrial warfare were overwhelmingly in favor of the Allies, and Rommel could see it in every captured supply depot. But abundance created its own problem for American logistics, one that actually offended German military sensibility. Waste. Americans threw away more supplies than the Afrika Korps received monthly. This wasn't incompetence. It was deliberate policy. American logistics doctrine emphasized overwhelming supply. Better to have too much than too little. Better to waste tonnage than have soldiers go without. The concept horrified German staff officers trained in efficiency. Lieutenant Colonel Fritz Bayerlein, Rommel's chief of staff, examined captured American logistics manuals in January 1943. What he read shocked him more than enemy tactics or equipment. American planning factors called for 40 pounds of supplies per soldier daily. 40 pounds. That included everything: food, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies. German planning factors assumed 15 pounds per soldier daily, and that was planning factors, theoretical numbers. Actual delivery was far less. American forces received their 40 pounds. They received it consistently, predictably, without fail. Convoys arrived on schedule. Supplies moved forward efficiently. Nothing ran out. Bayerlein brought the manual to Rommel. Herr Feldmarschall, they're planning to waste supplies. Look at this passage. Excess rations may be destroyed rather than transported if supply situation permits. Destroyed. They would rather burn food than calculate more precisely. Rommel read the passage twice. His expression didn't change, but his hands tightened on the manual until knuckles showed white. They can afford to burn food, he said finally, because they have enough to burn. We salvage cigarette butts from the sand and they throw away fresh rations. The waste wasn't actually waste, in military terms. It was insurance against supply disruption. It was recognition that perfect efficiency costs more than modest overproduction. It was understanding that a soldier who never worries about supply can focus entirely on fighting. American quartermasters calculated that roughly 10% of forward supplies would be lost to spoilage, damage, or inefficiency. They shipped 12% extra to cover losses and still maintain full strength. German logistics aimed for zero waste and achieved constant shortage. The American system was inefficient by German standards and overwhelmingly effective by any practical measure. February 19th, 43. Rommel stood in his command vehicle near the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. This was different from Egypt. The Afrika Korps had retreated 1,500 miles from El Alamein, fighting rearguard actions the entire way. Now, American forces approached from the west, fresh troops who'd landed in Operation Torch back in November. Rommel planned to hit them hard before they learned desert warfare. His forces struck at Kasserine on February 14th. Initial results were spectacular. American units, inexperienced and poorly deployed, broke under German attack. Panzers rolled through the pass. Artillery fire scattered American positions. For 3 days, it looked like the old Afrika Korps. Magic might still work. Then, the Americans fell back, reorganized, and something happened that Rommel had seen before, but never quite this dramatically. Supply trucks arrived, hundreds of them, ammunition, fuel, replacement tanks, fresh troops. American logistics responded to crisis not by carefully rationing scarce resources, but by flooding the battlefield with everything their forces might possibly need. Within 48 hours of the initial German breakthrough, American artillery ammunition expenditure at Kasserine exceeded the Afrika Korps' total ammunition reserve in Tunisia. American guns fired not in carefully aimed salvos to conserve shells, but in sustained barrages that simply obliterated target areas. By February 22nd, Rommel's offensive stalled not because American troops had suddenly become expert soldiers, but because American supplies had turned defensive positions into fortresses. Major Georg Briel, commanding a panzer battalion at Kasserine, reported what he saw with something approaching awe. We advanced 8 kilometers on the 14th. The Americans retreated in disorder, abandoning equipment. We captured 30 vehicles, mostly supply trucks. All were full. Food, ammunition, medical supplies. We thought this was their main supply dump. He paused in his report. On the 21st, we attempted to continue the advance. American artillery opened fire with intensity I've only seen at Stalingrad. The barrage lasted 3 hours without pause, 3 hours of continuous fire. After the barrage, their infantry counterattacked with tank support, fresh Sherman tanks, not the damaged ones we'd knocked out earlier. New tanks. Where did they come from? We've been in Tunisia for 3 months and received no tank replacements. The answer to Briel's question was simple. American industry. More specifically, the Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit, which alone was producing 800 M4 Sherman tanks monthly, 800 tanks from a single factory. The entire German tank production in February 1943 was 430 vehicles, and that was from factories scattered across Germany and occupied Europe. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Rommel withdrew from Kasserine on February 23rd. The attack had succeeded tactically, inflicting 7,000 American casualties and capturing significant equipment, but strategically, it changed nothing. American forces would replace their losses within weeks. The Afrika Korps couldn't replace its losses at all. The fuel expended in the attack, approximately 300 tons, represented nearly half the month's supply allocation. March 1943. Rommel flew back to Germany, officially for health reasons, the stomach problems and jaundice that had plagued him since El Alamein. Unofficially, because he understood Tunisia was hopeless and wanted to tell Hitler directly. The meeting took place on March 10th at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Rommel presented his assessment with characteristic bluntness. Mein Führer, the supply situation in North Africa makes continued resistance impossible. American logistics are overwhelming our defenses through sheer quantity. They land 12,000 tons daily in Algeria. We receive 2,000 tons weekly in Tunisia. The mathematics are simple. Hitler interrupted. I don't want to hear about mathematics. I want to hear about will, about determination, about German soldiers holding every meter of ground. Rommel tried again. Our soldiers are determined. They're also starving. Last month, forward units received 60% of required rations. Ammunition allocations are 40% of combat requirements. Medical supplies are critically short. We're treating wounded with captured American morphine because our own supplies don't arrive. The Führer's face reddened. The enemy also has supply problems. You're exaggerating difficulties to excuse defeat. Rommel took a folder from his briefcase. These are captured American logistics documents. May I show you their planning factors? Hitler waved dismissively. I don't need to see enemy documents. I need generals who can win battles regardless of supply. The conversation continued for another hour, but accomplished nothing. Rommel left understanding that Hitler either couldn't or wouldn't grasp the fundamental reality. Modern armies run on logistics. Superior tactics and courage can't overcome systematic supply advantages of the magnitude Americans were demonstrating. The Field Marshal returned to his headquarters in Germany, not to Tunisia. He would never see North Africa again. The campaign ended in May 1943. 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered. This was more prisoners than Stalingrad, more equipment lost than in any previous German defeat. Among the captured supplies were documents that British and American intelligence officers studied with great interest. Afrika Korps ration returns, fuel consumption reports, ammunition expenditure rates. The documents revealed what Allied logistics officers already suspected. The Afrika Korps had been fighting on empty for months. December 1942, fuel allocations gave each German tank an average operational range of 60 miles before refueling. British tanks had 300-mile range. German infantry divisions received 8 tons of supplies daily. British divisions received 40 tons. American divisions received 60 tons. The disparity wasn't about efficiency or waste. It was about production capacity. It was about industrial systems capable of producing, transporting, and distributing supplies faster than any army could consume them. It was about abundance so extreme that waste became irrelevant because there was always more coming. A captured German logistics officer, Major Karl Strecker, gave interrogators in Cairo a statement that summarized the psychological impact better than any statistical analysis. We knew we were losing when we stopped thinking about victory and started thinking about food, not strategy, not tactics. Food. Every morning, the question wasn't, how do we attack the enemy, but what will we eat today? He continued, describing routine that had become surreal. American prisoners we captured in Tunisia ate better than our own officers. Their rations, even field rations, contained meat, vegetables, fruit, chocolate, real chocolate, not ersatz. We would interrogate an American private, and he would casually mention throwing away his breakfast because he didn't like scrambled eggs. Throwing away eggs. Our men hadn't seen fresh eggs in months. The interrogation report, filed away in British military archives, includes a detail that speaks volumes. Strecker mentioned that German soldiers at Kasserine had been more interested in capturing American supply trucks than American prisoners. The trucks contained food, cigarettes, medical supplies. We could use those immediately. Prisoners we had to guard and feed, and we barely had food for ourselves. This wasn't isolated behavior. Throughout the North African campaign, especially after El Alamein, German and Italian troops prioritized capturing supplies over tactical objectives. After-action reports from British units noted that Axis attacks often focused on supply depots rather than strategic positions. One British quartermaster officer wrote in January 1943, "The Germans are shopping, not fighting. They hit our forward dumps, take what they can carry, and withdraw before we can counterattack." The shopping, as the British officer called it, revealed desperation. The Afrika Korps wasn't just low on supplies. They were psychologically defeated by abundance they couldn't match. Every captured depot showed them what a properly supplied army looked like. Every abandoned British position contained more food than they'd seen in weeks. Every engagement with American forces demonstrated artillery expenditure that seemed impossible. Lieutenant Werner Paulsen, 5th Panzer Regiment, kept a diary throughout the North African campaign. His entries from March 1943 show the psychological toll. March 3rd. Attacked American position near Medellin. Their artillery response was immediate and overwhelming. Must have fired 500 shells into our assembly area within 10 minutes. Where do they get so much ammunition? March 7th. Captured British supply truck. Found tinned ham, real butter, tea, sugar, cigarettes. Divided it among the company. Men were more excited than after a victory. March 15th. Paulsen's final entry before being wounded. Saw American supply convoy today through binoculars. Must have been 200 trucks. Driving in daylight, not even bothering with camouflage. They know we can't attack because we have no fuel. They know we can't bomb them because Luftwaffe has no aviation fuel. They drive past our positions like tourists, and we watch them because what else can we do? The fuel situation had become critical by early 1943. The mathematics were brutal. The Afrika Korps required 4,000 tons of fuel monthly for defensive operations. They received an average of 1,500 tons. Tanks sat immobile. Trucks couldn't transport supplies from ports. Aircraft remained grounded. Rommel had commented bitterly in February, "I have the finest tank commanders in the world and no fuel for their tanks." Meanwhile, Allied fuel supplies approached excess. American planning allocated 500 gallons of gasoline per vehicle monthly. This covered operational movement, training, and a 50% reserve against unexpected consumption. British 8th Army had fuel dumps so large that German aerial reconnaissance initially mistook them for small towns. Rows of 55-gallon drums stretching for miles, each painted with identification markings, organized with industrial precision. The contrast became visceral in April 1943 during the final battles in Tunisia. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who'd replaced Rommel in overall command, launched attacks using tanks that were literally running on fumes. Panzer commanders reported fuel gauges showing empty before they reached their objectives. Some tanks were towed to starting positions by other tanks, attacked, then had to be abandoned when they ran out of fuel during combat. American tank commanders, by contrast, rarely thought about fuel. Their tanks were topped off every evening. Fuel trucks followed combat formations, ready to refuel any vehicle that needed it. If a tank broke down, fuel wasn't transferred to other vehicles. It was left in the disabled tank because more fuel was always coming. The American system assumed abundance. The German system required austerity and couldn't even maintain that. Food became equally disparate. By April 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia were on starvation rations. Official allocation was 1,600 calories daily. Actual delivery was often 1,200 calories or less. Men lost weight visibly. Medical officers reported increasing cases of malnutrition-related illnesses. Scurvy appeared in some units because fresh vegetables hadn't been available for months. A captured Italian officer, Captain Antonio Rossi, described the situation to American interrogators. "The Germans received slightly more than us, but even they were hungry. I watched a German sergeant eat grass, and not as a joke. He was seriously eating grass because he was hungry." This was a veteran sergeant from the Afrika Korps, a soldier who had fought since 1941, eating grass in April 1943. American soldiers in Tunisia received 2,800 calories daily minimum. Field rations included meat, fruit, vegetables, bread, coffee, sugar. Special occasions brought fresh food prepared by mobile kitchens. Hot meals served daily when tactical situation permitted. Soldiers complained about field rations being monotonous. Axis soldiers would have considered those same rations feast-worthy. The psychological impact of constant hunger is difficult to overstate. Soldiers think about food when they're not eating enough. They think about it constantly. Concentration suffers. Morale deteriorates. Minor injuries heal slowly. Illness spreads more easily. The Afrika Korps, in April 1943, wasn't just outnumbered and outgunned. They were physically weakened by months of insufficient nutrition. Medical supplies told a similar story. German field hospitals in Tunisia ran out of morphine in March 1943. Wounded soldiers received what could be scavenged from captured British and American supplies. Anesthetics were critically short. Bandages were washed and reused. Antibiotics, the new sulfur drugs that could prevent infection, were reserved for the most severe cases because supplies wouldn't last otherwise. American medical facilities in North Africa functioned at levels that seemed almost wasteful by German standards. Mobile surgical hospitals followed combat formations within hours. Wounded soldiers received immediate treatment with full pharmaceutical supplies. Blood plasma was available in quantity. Antibiotics were administered routinely. Bandages were used once and discarded. The mortality rate from wounds was significantly lower in American units, not because American doctors were better trained, but because they had everything they needed. A captured German medical officer, Dr. Friedrich Kleist, was shown through an American field hospital in May 1943. His reaction was documented by the American medical officer who gave the tour. The German doctor seemed particularly affected by our supply cabinets. We have morphine in quantity, sulfur drugs, plasma, everything organized and readily available. He said his last supply shipment had been in February and contained 40 ampules of morphine for a division of 10,000 men. He actually became emotional looking at our supplies, said his wounded soldiers deserved better. They did deserve better. The Afrika Korps had fought with incredible tenacity under impossible conditions. But deserving better doesn't change arithmetic. Germany couldn't match American production. Italy couldn't protect supply convoys. The Axis forces in North Africa were doomed not by inferior soldiers or tactics, but by logistics that never had a chance against industrial capacity operating on a different scale entirely. Ammunition provides the clearest statistical comparison. In April 1943, during the final battles around Tunis, American artillery units fired an average of 100 rounds per gun daily. German artillery, when they fired at all, averaged 15 rounds per gun daily. American doctrine called for overwhelming firepower. Fire missions involved entire battalions saturating target areas with hundreds of shells. German doctrine required precision because ammunition had to be conserved. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The results were predictable. American artillery suppressed German positions so thoroughly that counterfire was nearly impossible. German artillery, firing carefully aimed shots to conserve ammunition, had minimal effect on American operations that could simply absorb casualties and continue. An American infantry officer, Lieutenant John Harrigan, noted in his diary, "The Germans are good soldiers, but they can't fight when our artillery pins them down. And our artillery never seems to run out of shells. They never ran out because American factories produced artillery ammunition faster than American guns could fire it. In 1943, American production of 75mm and 105mm artillery shells exceeded 18 million rounds. That's 50,000 shells produced daily. The entire Afrika Korps expended approximately 2 million rounds during the entire North African campaign from 1941 to 1943. The numbers become almost absurd when examining specific engagements. At the Mareth Line in March 1943, British artillery, supporting Montgomery's attack, fired 460,000 shells in the preliminary bombardment. 460,000 shells in one battle. The Afrika Korps' total artillery ammunition on hand at that time was approximately 80,000 rounds for all of Tunisia. Rommel had seen this coming. His reports to Berlin throughout late 1942 and early 1943 repeatedly emphasized the supply crisis. He presented statistics, detailed analyses, captured American logistics documents. The response from Hitler and the High Command was consistent. Demands for greater effort, accusations of defeatism, orders to fight harder with the resources available. The disconnect between battlefield reality and Berlin's perception was total. Hitler believed will could overcome material disadvantage. He believed German soldiers were inherently superior to American soldiers, and that superiority would decide the campaign. He believed the supply problems were temporary, that one major victory would change the strategic situation. Rommel knew better. He'd seen American logistics in action. He'd captured their supply depots. He'd interrogated their prisoners. He'd read their manuals. He understood that American military power rested on industrial production that Germany couldn't match, even if every factory in the Reich ran 3 shifts daily. The Americans were producing war material in such quantities that they could afford to be wasteful by German standards and still overwhelm any opposition through sheer abundance. His report to Hitler in March 1943, written just before he left North Africa permanently, contained a passage that summarized his understanding. The American supply system operates on principles incomprehensible to European military thinking. They do not calculate minimum requirements. They calculate maximum possible consumption and then exceed it. This is not wasteful. It is systematic overwhelming of enemy capacity to resist. Against such abundance, tactical excellence becomes irrelevant. Hitler dismissed the report. He told Rommel directly during their March meeting that the field marshal was exaggerating American capabilities to excuse his own failures. The Führer still believed that one brilliant counterattack, one unexpected tactical innovation, one display of willpower could reverse the situation. He understood individual battles, but couldn't grasp industrial warfare's fundamental mathematics. May 13th, 1943. The end came in Tunisia. General von Arnim surrendered the remaining Axis forces, approximately 250,000 soldiers. Among the equipment captured were detailed logistics records that Allied intelligence officers examined with professional interest. The records showed systematic supply failure across every category. Fuel deliveries in April averaged 40% of requirements. Ammunition deliveries were 35%, food deliveries were 50%, medical supplies were 25%. The records also showed something else. German logistics officers had continued planning and calculating with Germanic precision even as their supply system collapsed. They maintained meticulous records of shortages. They projected future requirements, assuming supplies would somehow materialize. They did everything correctly, except receive the supplies they needed. An American logistics officer, Colonel Robert McCarthy, studied the captured records and wrote an assessment that became part of the official after-action report. German logistics planning was excellent. Their systems were efficient. Their calculations were accurate. They simply had nothing to work with. It's like watching a master chef in a kitchen with no food. The skill is apparent, but ultimately useless. McCarthy's report included comparisons that illustrated the disparity. American forces in North Africa received 75 pounds of supplies per soldier daily by April 1943. This included food, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, everything. German forces received 15 pounds per soldier daily on paper, less than 10 pounds actually delivered. The ratio was 7-1 at minimum, possibly 10-1 in reality. But the numbers don't capture the psychological dimension. German soldiers hadn't just fought with inadequate supplies. They'd watched their enemy operate with overwhelming abundance. They'd seen American supply convoys driving casually past their positions. They'd captured depots full of food and equipment. They'd faced artillery barrages that seemed to never end. They'd learned that courage and skill weren't enough against an enemy that could simply bury them under material superiority. Rommel understood this psychological defeat before the physical defeat became final. His last report from Tunisia mentioned it specifically. The troops have witnessed enemy material superiority to such an extent that they no longer believe our propaganda about American industrial incapacity. They have seen with their own eyes that American equipment is not only abundant, but often superior to our own. This psychological impact may prove more damaging than actual casualties. He was right. The survivors of the Afrika Korps, who were captured in Tunisia and eventually returned to Germany after the war, carried with them knowledge that contradicted official propaganda. They'd seen American abundance. They knew German claims about enemy weakness were lies. Some of them, the perceptive ones, understood that if America could supply one campaign in North Africa with such overwhelming logistics, what would happen when that same industrial capacity focused on invading Europe? The answer came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. When Allied forces landed in Normandy, they brought with them logistics that made North Africa look modest by comparison. The invasion fleet landed 40,000 vehicles in the first week. By the end of June, Allied forces in Normandy were receiving 20,000 tons of supplies daily. By August, 40,000 tons daily. By September, over 50,000 tons daily, flowing across the English Channel. Rommel was in France by then, commanding Army Group B, defending against the invasion. He saw the same pattern repeating. German forces fought skillfully with inadequate supplies. Allied forces advanced methodically with overwhelming material support. The tactical situation was different, the terrain was different, but the fundamental mathematics remained unchanged. American and British industrial production could sustain logistical systems that German production couldn't match. On July 17, 1944, British aircraft strafed Rommel's staff car. The Field Marshal suffered severe head injuries and was evacuated to Germany. He never returned to combat. 3 months later, he was forced to commit suicide after being implicated in the July 20th plot to kill Hitler. His death came before the war's end, before the full scope of Allied material superiority became apparent in the final campaigns. But Rommel had understood the essential truth back in North Africa. He'd understood it standing in that British supply depot in January 1943, looking at crates of American food. He'd understood it reading reports of 12,000 tons landing daily in Egypt, while his own forces received 2,000 tons weekly. He'd understood it, watching his soldiers grow thin while prisoners ate better than his officers. The understanding was simple but devastating. Modern war is industrial. Victory goes not to the most courageous soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but to the side that can produce, transport, and distribute supplies in overwhelming quantity. Tactics matter, training matters, leadership matters, but logistics matter more. An army that never runs out of fuel, ammunition, and food will eventually defeat an army that constantly struggles with shortages, regardless of comparative skill or determination. American logistics in World War II weren't wasteful by any meaningful standard. They were systematic application of industrial abundance to military objectives. The waste that German officers criticized, the casual disposal of excess supplies, the 40-pound daily allocation per soldier, the ammunition expenditure that seemed excessive, all of it served a purpose. It ensured that no American soldier ever had to fight at less than full capacity because supplies were short. That assurance, that certainty, that logistics would never fail, provided psychological advantages that matched the material ones. American soldiers knew supplies were coming. They knew if they expended ammunition today, more would arrive tomorrow. They knew medical care was available. They knew they'd eat properly. That knowledge allowed them to focus entirely on fighting rather than worrying about logistics. German soldiers knew the opposite. They knew supplies were uncertain. They knew ammunition had to be conserved. They knew food was short. They knew medical care was limited. That knowledge created constant stress that wore down even the most disciplined troops. The Afrika Korps didn't break because they were cowards. They broke because fighting, while hungry, undersupplied, and watching the enemy operate with unlimited resources destroys morale more effectively than any tactical defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.